Jobs freely acknowledged how these outside influences had affected him.
He was always trying to look for external references and external influences. And he'd talk about, his Mercedes was beautifully designed because those German guys were thinking beautiful thoughts, I guess. He loved aphorisms. Picasso said, good artists copy, great artists steal. And he loved to say that, and he's the guy who came up with something would be insanely great. What does that mean?
Much of what Apple did was built on the efforts of others. A 1979 deal gave him access to Xerox technology. One thing blew him away, a prototype mouse. He gave his own team orders to make one, only better.
You got to build it for less than 15 bucks. It's got to last 2 years. I want it to work on the desktop, a normal Formica desktop. And I also want to be able to use it on my jeans. As I left the meeting, headed out to my car, I was thinking, does this really make sense? Is Steve crazy, or is there something here?
If Steve wanted something, his team just had to innovate. So for Dean, that meant a trip to the drugstore.
As I entered Walgreens, I had in my mind, most importantly, was where do I find these spheres, these balls, to be a part of the mouse? And I had thought about the underarm deodorant as the right solution. And I emerged with some roll-on deodorant and a butter dish. And as you can see here, there's, of course, different size balls, depending upon how it is applied. Not only that, but then once I had the balls, I said, what's a quick way to have a structure to put around the ball so that I can start interacting with it? And I remember going to the housewares area, and I found a butter dish, which was about this big. And that became the beginning part for the mouse as I felt it. So I used the butter dish, the roll-on ball, and was able to create a prototype. It's hard to believe that in a design so small as something that fits in your hand, there could be much controversy around it. But it turns out there was one major controversy, which was how many buttons should there be? The original Xerox PARC had 3 buttons, and there was a great debate about how many buttons were right. And Steve always had the notion of simplicity. The magic of Apple products is simple. There was one button, and it's magic.
From the early days, one man influenced Steve Jobs more than any other, his friend and rival, Bill Gates. Apple's history interweaves with Microsoft's. Their CEOs gave a unique interview to journalist Walter Mossberg.
It was, to my knowledge, the only time they ever got on stage together to submit themselves to an extended interview with journalists.
Their interview gave Walt unparalleled insights into the dynamics of their relationship.
But then there was a floating
From the start, Gates was overshadowed by the more polished, confident Jobs.
Let me
tell this story.
So Woz, I'm not fake Steve Jobs.
If you saw them together, Steve always dominated the conversation. In part, that's because I think Bill was always fascinated by Steve. He was a real observer, and he would just look at this guy and say, what the heck is going on here?
We've kept our marriage secret for over a decade now.
He admired Steve for his ability to interface with people, connect with them, affect them.
They were partners, for a long time. The very first Apple II computers had Microsoft software in them.
But while the banter was good-natured, the rivalry between the two was deep-rooted.
I personally can attest to having heard each of them say very nasty things about the other off the record in private over the years. I think the antipathy partly grew out of 2 things. On Jobs' side, he believed that Microsoft had stolen the basic ideas in the Mac. From the point of view of Gates, I think He found Jobs difficult to deal with.
Steve is so known for his restraint.
I think Gates felt that Jobs got more credit than he might have deserved as being the great technologist.
Neither person is hugely likable. Certainly, Steve Jobs is an acquired taste, and so is Bill Gates, for that matter. They're both have their moments. Bill Gates is a better friend than Steve Jobs, but Steve Jobs is more fun than Bill Gates.
Jobs had glamour and dynamism. By the mid-1980s, he was one of the richest self-made men in America. He was just 29.
People are going to bring them home over the weekend to work on something. Sunday morning, they're not going to be able to get their kids away from them, and maybe someday they'll even buy a second one to leave at home.
Which made him a natural subject for Playboy. Interviewing Jobs was a unique experience for writer David Sheff.
The phone rang one day, and it was not a PR person who called, but it was Jobs himself. And it really was an indication of the way that he did business and really continued to do business. Apple was very different. The second you walked in the door, you felt like you were in a completely new environment. The conference rooms, instead of, number 103C, were called Da Vinci and Michelangelo and Picasso. And indeed, it was Picasso that I was escorted to see Jobs for the first time.
As the two got to know each other, Sheff realized he had a front row seat on what was then an unimaginable technological future.
Steve started drawing on a placemat. We went back and forth, and basically by the end of that constructed what looks exactly like an iPad. Steve said this machine, this small device as big as a book, would allow us to keep in touch with one another. It would replace the telephone and would replace bookstores. He saw it as a reader on this very small device and read it with editing capacity, note-taking capacity. I mean, he really envisioned the iPad almost 30 years ago.
Jobs and Sheff quickly became close friends.
Through sort of the late 60s and 70s in very similar ways, going through some of the counterculture, being influenced by some of the Eastern mysticism, Buddhism, the LSD culture, Timothy Leary. He was always so excited about everything, and we went to movies together, and we went to the opera together, and he could talk about everything, and he was this incredibly giving, loyal friend. When I was having a hard time, would be on the phone, would drive up from Silicon Valley, take me out to dinner and hang out and take walks with me, and that's pretty rare.
In 1984, they visited the home of Yoko Ono for the 9th birthday party of Sean, her son with John Lennon. Jobs took along a birthday gift that fascinated not only Sean, but the whole star-studded guest list.
Steve opened it up, pulled out what was one of those first Macintoshes off the assembly line, set it up on the floor. Sean was down on the floor with him. Steve turned it on, put Mac Paint in there. It took him about 2 seconds to show Sean how to deal with it, and Sean pretty soon was drawing pictures. Later, Steve told me it was one of the first times he'd watched a child with a Mac. Eventually, I sort of became aware that there were some people, who'd come into the room, and I looked over my shoulder, and there was Andy Warhol. So there was this great moment that I'll never forget. Andy Warhol gets down on his hands and knees with Sean on one side and Steve on the other side. I remember that Warhol would pick up the mouse and, instead of gliding it along the floor, the tiled floor in Sean's bedroom, he would sort of pick it up and was trying to figure out how to make it work. And Steve very patiently would sort of lower his hand down and say, no, you kind of push it along. So Andy sort of fooled around with it, and he was completely mesmerized. I mean, when he zoned in on something, the rest of the world disappeared, and that was what it was like watching Warhol in front of a Macintosh for the first time. And then, he got this big smile on his face, and he looked up, he said, I drew a circle. And it was great.
Life had been good for Steve Jobs.
He was worth $1 million when he was 21. He was worth $10 million when he was 22. He was worth $100 million when he was 23 years old. So he knew nothing but success. And when you're 23 years old, you're worth $100 million, you are pretty damn full of yourself. And that's what Steve became. And so he had a huge ambition.
But in 1985, at the age of 30, his charmed run of luck was about to come to an abrupt halt. Seeking someone to help run his rapidly expanding business, he hired in Pepsi executive John Sculley.
President John Sculley admits Apple will be just another personal computer company unless Macintosh becomes an industry milestone in the next 100 days.
There was kind of a love affair at the beginning. I mean, Steve really trusted him and really saw a kindred spirit, someone who would help him build Apple. His love was Apple. He envisioned being with Apple for his life. He said, but that doesn't mean there won't be periods when I will leave and I will do other things and I will, my life will weave in and out of Apple.
Once again, Jobs' foresight was spot on. 2 years after Sculley arrived at Apple, the love affair turned sour as company profits faltered.
Steve was never fired from Apple, but he was ostracized and demoted and put in an office in an empty building. And after that, he resigned in 1985 and then immediately sold his more than 6 million shares. He was the largest single shareholder of Apple at the time, and sold his stock at a bad price and didn't get as much money as he should have or could have had he done it smartly, but he was angry.
He felt so betrayed, so angry, so disillusioned that Sculley was, in his mind, at least part of, if not the ringleader in what he viewed as a coup, to remove him. And Steve was pissed off. And he really was pissed off about Sculley because he brought Sculley in and trusted him and then felt betrayed by him.
So he sold his stock and went off, took his tens of millions of dollars, but not hundreds of millions of dollars, and started a new life.
But there were still people willing to back him with hard cash. One of them was self-made Texas billionaire and former presidential candidate Ross Perot. He saw how wounded Jobs had been by Apple.
I think it was, first, a tremendous disappointment, which I can certainly understand. Secondly, he picked himself up, dusted himself off, and started all over again with very little hesitation. And I really admired that. Otherwise you could just sit around in a dark room and sulk about it, but that's not Steve.
Steve started a company called Next to do a computer that was going to be what he thought Apple should have been, to aim it at the education market because Apple had had conspicuous success in education. There were some people he could steal from Apple to market to that segment, and he thought starting small made sense.
But even starting small needs big money.
I invested $20 million in Next. He contacted me, asked me to be a principal investor and to serve on the board with him, and I agreed to do it just because of my support for him. And there's no question in my mind that if he wanted to do it, it would get done. He's great with attracting and motivating the best of the best people. He's great at encouraging them to be creative and come up with new ideas and not just be little robots, which many big companies just want you to be a little robot and do what you're told to do, and the last thing they want to hear from you is a creative idea. Steve loved those creative ideas, and that was a magic part of the success of Next.
A new Steve Jobs was rising out of the ashes of the boardroom battle at Apple. And this time, he was ruthless.
He invested $5 million capital in a corporation called Pixar, and he took 70% of the company, and the employees took 30%. Steve kept investing because we would run out of money, and he did not want to be embarrassed by a failure after having been booted out of Apple, so he would put more money in and take more equity away from the employees. So over the course of about 4 or 5 years, he owned it all.
Alvey quickly felt he was losing control to the new master.
I would look at my employees, looking at Steve, and I realized they're in love. They're just looking up at him with big doe eyes, just soaking in everything he's saying as if it's truth. And it wasn't. So you can see he was very disruptive. Our management style was to be 2 hours away from him, try not to have him come into the building.
Standing up to Jobs could be a painful experience, as Alvey found out in one memorable boardroom meeting.
He turned on me, total street bully, in my face, screaming. And I went crazy. I'd never been there. I don't ever want to be there again. That's kind of why, that's the reason I got away from him. We were screaming at each other in full bull rage, with our faces about that far apart. And during that, so he was insulting my Southwestern accent. It was just street bully stuff. I still don't know what happened. Something broke. And during this face-off, literally a face-off, I marched past him and wrote on the whiteboard. Now, it was an unspoken rule, which I hate, unspoken rules, that only he could sit in front of the whiteboard and only he could use it. Nobody had ever tested it, but at this point I tested it. I marched past him and wrote on the whiteboard. He said, you can't do that. And I said, what, write on a whiteboard? And he stormed out of the room. So that was and then I was in shock for the next week or months or so. I just didn't know what had happened, you know.
Everyone in Steve Jobs' life went through three phases. They were either being seduced, ignored, or scourged. And it all depended upon whether he needed you or not. If he needed you, he was your best friend, and he would seduce you. And then you would work like a dog, and if you weren't working hard enough, he would scourge you, and ultimately he would throw you away.
On the personal level, it was not fun. It was not the way I want to be treated by another human being.
Steve ultimately betrayed everyone.
And some said the new Steve Jobs wasn't afraid of claiming all the credit, too.
Disney took Toy Story and another one of their movies to New York for the critics to see. And the critics they didn't even look at the other movie. They just went nuts when they saw Toy Story. And they came back and basically told Steve that it was going to be a huge success. And that's the point when his ability to see something spectacular is about to happen, he just moved in and exploited that right to the hilt. And I must say he did a great job. He became a billionaire from it. Awesome. So Steve's genius is to move when he has a good idea. I don't think they are necessarily his ideas, but boy, does he know how to move and market them like crazy. He's the world's genius marketeer, including of his own self-image.
But the best was yet to come for Jobs. Apple was in trouble. They wanted him back.
They were begging him to come back because they knew he could fix it. And he did come back, and he fixed it, and the rest is history.
One man who witnessed Jobs' return to Apple was friend Walt Mossberg.
He came back to Apple, and the company was almost dead. Literally, it was like 90 days from going bankrupt. He said to the people at this very demoralized, almost out of business company, we're not looking backward. I don't really care that we once had the first successful personal computer. I really don't care that we were famous and successful. We're not anymore, and this is where we're starting from, and this is where we're moving.
And so when you see the second coming of Steve Jobs in Apple, Apple went from being just a wide open, wacky company to being a very disciplined company that understood its financials at a level that few companies do. And that's because Steve thought of every dollar as being his every dollar.
They have resolved these differences in a very, very...
It was an investment from Bill Gates that ultimately helped to save Apple. But when Gates made a live appearance with Jobs to explain the deal, it didn't go down well with the loyal Apple audience.